This week's Torah portion, Parashat Bo, begins by telling us, rather shockingly actually, that God is the one who hardens Pharaoh's heart. Now first, a brief word about the Hebrew that's used in this Torah portion and the one previous to it that translates often as hardening of the heart. The first verse of this week's Torah portion includes God's words to Moses. Hichbarti et libo. God tells Moses that God has made Pharaoh's heart kaved, which means heavy. It's actually related to the same word kavod, which can mean honor or dignity. And it's about treating someone with weight, with heaviness. Hichbarti et libo. Elsewhere in the chapters preceding this one and going on a little bit further in the Torah, there's a couple of other words that are used. One is a root kashe, which means hard, and in another place the word chazak is used, which means to strengthen Pharaoh's heart. So these three words, to make the heart heavy, to harden the heart, and to sort of strengthen the heart, are used throughout the narrative. And from the context, the form suggests that Pharaoh, through this hardening of the heart, becomes crueler and more stubborn. Now, that Pharaoh is cruel and stubborn is quite obvious from the Torah's narrative. He's a tyrant. He oppresses our people. That shouldn't surprise us. But that God would be to blame for Pharaoh's hard-heartedness, now that's problematic. Firstly, consider for a moment just how vast our universe is. The scale is impossible for us to grasp. That God would be involved on such a minute, granular level at all is extraordinary. Many theologians and ordinary believers alike imagine a more transcendent God who's not involved in every aspect of the day-to-day existence of this vast universe. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is, if God were to get involved in the behavior and actions of individual human beings, why not make their hearts softer? Why not make us kinder and gentler people? If a benevolent God were to dictate our behavior, why wouldn't God have us follow, as it were, the better angels of our nature, so that we might become our very best selves? And finally, if God really were the cause of Pharaoh's stubbornness, then how, as a matter of strict justice, can God then punish Pharaoh for behavior for which God is partially responsible? Now, my own theology leads me to reject the notion of a God so immanent, so engaged in the everyday workings of our world as to harden or soften the hearts of mortals. For me, the degree to which we behave cruelly or compassionately towards others and towards our world is more a function of personality, of upbringing, communal norms, perhaps fear of punishment sometimes, as well as a particular individual's commitment to a life of service, to living a reflective life, and to personal growth and accountability. For me, Pharaoh's cruelty was no more or less a part of God's plan for this world than were the machinations of Khmelnytsky or Stalin or Hitler, Yamach Shemam, may their names be blotted out. And you could add any other tyrant to that list. Unfortunately, there's no shortage. Now, many commentators note that at the beginning of the narrative, the Hebrew text makes it clear that Pharaoh is responsible for the hardening of his own heart. The way the verb is used, it makes it clear that Pharaoh is the one doing the hardening. The text then suggests that over time, Pharaoh simply becomes a more bitter, angry, vindictive ruler. Now, this should be rather unsurprising to us, as we have many examples of such behavior throughout human history. And as Lord Acton famously observed more than a century ago, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Only later, note the commentators, does the text suggest that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And so the lesson is really one about human behavior and the way that choices we make can, over time, become determinative. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, of blessed memory, compares this to a type of addiction. And here's how he phrases it. He says, the first few times you smoke a cigarette or drink alcohol or take drugs, you do so freely. You know the risks, but you ignore them. But as time goes on, your dependency increases until the craving is so intense that you are almost powerless to resist it. At that point, you may have to go into rehabilitation. You no longer, on your own, have the ability to stop. And here's how the Talmud puts it: a prisoner cannot release himself from prison. Addiction is a physical phenomenon, but there are moral equivalents, Rabbi Sacks teaches. For example, suppose on one significant occasion you tell a lie, and people now believe something about you that's not true, and they question you about it. Or when it comes up in conversation, you find yourself having to tell more lies to support the first one. As Sir Walter Scott put it, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. So according to this reading, Pharaoh's cruelty is entirely a matter of his own choosing, his own behavior. Little by little, because of his own actions and decisions, Pharaoh becomes crueler and crueler and more stubborn until there's no turning back. And so this reading suggests that God is not making Pharaoh into a monster. Pharaoh becomes a monster all on his own. Now, Rabbi Sacks notes that just as individuals can, little by little, step by step, devolve into the worst version of themselves, so too can institutions, governments, and societies. As he puts it, we lose our freedom gradually, often without noticing it. It's really hard to read these words regarding this week's Torah portion on this Shabbat, almost exactly 1 year after the January 6th insurrection. As we learn more and more about the events leading up to that day, it becomes clearer and clearer that government officials, including the president, attempted to undermine the will of the people. It's also quite clear that the big lie that continues to be told about a stolen election is little by little eroding our democracy. As Jews, whatever your party affiliation or political preference, we should be very, very concerned about threats to a democracy that has protected our rights as a minority people for more than 2 centuries. There's nowhere in the diaspora, in the long and beautiful history of the Jewish people, that we've been safer than here. And a principal reason for that is rule of law and our democratic traditions. Rabbi Sacks, even as he described freedom's fragility, though, remained hopeful about its inevitability, and I hope he was right about this. Here's how he puts it: freedom in the deepest sense, the freedom to do the right and the good, is not a given. We acquire it or lose it gradually. In the end, tyrants bring about their own destruction, he writes, whereas those with willpower, courage, and the willingness to go against the consensus acquire a monumental freedom. That is what Judaism is: an invitation to freedom by resisting the idols and siren calls of the age. And I want to repeat that last line again, because this is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks' definition of Judaism, the core of what our tradition is all about: an invitation to freedom by resisting the idols and siren calls of the age. May we as individuals and as a society make choices that serve to habituate a yearning toward the good, toward justice, toward truth, and toward freedom, so that we and our children and our children's children may celebrate our Judaism in dignity and security, bringing light to others in the process throughout the ages.